Hi, and welcome back. This is part B of Wind Power Systems talk for Professor Bryan Karney's course CIV401 in winter 2023 at University of Toronto.
In this part, I'll be speaking about quantifying wind power, measuring just how much wind power you can get from a wind turbine, and then projecting how much wind power is available over a given region. Different factors in quantifying wind power. There's the power output of a specific single wind turbine. It's rated in a nameplate capacity for the maximum power that it can generate. Then there's another factor that you have to look at of how much over time does the wind actually blow, what percent of its rated capacity factor does it actually put out. Then you look at site characteristics. Where you put the wind turbine affects how much wind it's going to see over the course of a year and a decade. Local surface effects alter how much the wind varies between the surface and higher up. You can look at modeling of the wind flow across larger areas, regions, and nations, and you can do what's known as wind prospecting. We'll look at some maps produced by that kind of research. And then you can also look at the potential for how much wind could be integrated into the power grid of an entire system, a region, regional control area, and an entire continent. So for this engineering course, this should be a familiar formula. The power available from wind of a flowing fluid is equal to 1/2 of the swept area A times rho, the density of the fluid, times velocity to the third power. So as the wind speed increases, the power that you can extract from it goes up very quickly. The swept area of the rotor is A, that's a area for the formula for the area of a circle, and the air density rho, just a property of the current weather conditions. So colder air is denser, for example. And because it's the cube of the velocity, that's a really, really important factor, that a little bit more wind can get you a lot more power.
Beginning from the knowledge of those general principles of how you extract energy from a moving fluid, the application to designing wind turbines specifically takes into account some unique specific things about this that are different from, say, a hydro turbine. That since you're going from wind, which is a compressible fluid, you're using aerodynamics to design the rotor blades, and the inputs are not under your control. The wind will vary on its own. You have to be able to handle the changes in direction by slewing the turbine to point directly into the wind. And the wind speed will vary over time. You can have sensors on the turbine that pick up the immediate changes of those, and then your control design needs to allow for the fact that the wind is going to vary minute by minute. Then you want to match the properties of the generator that you're driving with the scale of the height of your tower, the length of your blades, and the airfoils that you use on them. The electronics of the generator have to work so that you can feed them into the power grid. You'll often have at a wind farm, you'll have a local distribution collection network, and you can make your own choices about how to do that. But in the grander scale of things connecting to a power grid, you've got to be able to do frequency control and synchronize with the AC sine wave. You've got to be able to dispatch power to match the load. So any grid operator is going to be able to tell you when to supply power and when not. And they may have to force you to curtail if you're supplying power when they don't need it. And then you have to do design to handle the same things that other generating stations have to be able to do. You need system protection and fault handling, both to protect your equipment and to not send the wrong kind of energy into the power grid, or create shorts or overdraw or anything like that. So on this, I found a really excellent overview article about wind turbine design and operating principles. J. Aho et al., a tutorial of wind turbine control for supporting grid frequency through active power control, from the 2012 American Control Conference. And there's the link. I highly recommend this one. Please go and find that article and have a look. It does a better job from the point of view of working engineers about what choices they make in designing wind turbines to work with all these variable inputs and to cooperate and play nicely with the power grid. So they understand it a lot better than I ever could. Great article. Please have a look.
So a key issue in analyzing how wind turbines extract energy from the moving atmosphere is the concept of vertical shear, where there's a higher velocity above than near the surface. Basically, air flowing over the surface of the Earth at high levels, high altitudes, it's known as the free air flow, and it'll have a speed conditioned by the moving masses of air. But at the ground, basically air in contact with the surface, we define the velocity at the surface to be 0. And then the characteristics of the surface, whether it's bumpy or smooth, whether there's mountains, tall buildings, trees and houses, or open water and fields, each of those has different effects on how much the speed varies between the surface and the near surfaces where a wind turbine can reach. If you build a short tower, you can see in the left side of the diagram, the red slope is very steep and has a higher change in velocity with height. That means that the top blade, as it's going around, each blade as it passes the top of the tower, encounters much higher wind speed than those passing across the bottom, and that creates stresses, torque inconsistencies in the rotation. That's a factor in the productivity of the wind turbine. So building a taller tower can get you into both higher winds and winds with less shear. Here's the power curve for the output of a specific model of a 1 megawatt wind turbine. And each different turbine design will have its own characteristic curve like this. So you can see that it does an S curve as the wind power begins at very low power. There's no output. The wind turbine can't overcome inertia and friction. You reach some sort of cut-in speed around, this one is 4 meters per second. It begins to produce a little bit of energy. As the wind increases, you can see there's a nice exponential increase in the torque that you're getting in the power you can produce. And then you begin approaching past 10 meters per second. That S-curve it turns to level off at the rated capacity of the turbine. So you have more torque after about 12 meters per second than the system can extract, and you're just limited by the capacity of the generator unit inside it. And then from 13 meters per second on up, the unit tops out. No matter how much more the wind blows, it doesn't get any more powerful. It's just producing its rated capacity. There's an additional limit that for safety reasons, the units are all designed to have some speed at which the system will stop the blades from producing power because there's just too much torque, and different methods for managing that, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So for this model, it would cut out at 25 meters per second on a 10-minute average. So if it's gusty and it's going 22, 27, 22, if it averages out to over 25, the cutoff system will cut in. If at any time the gusts exceed 30 meters per second, the system will go into cutoff mode instantaneously. Then it waits for the wind to cool down from that extreme, and this one has a reset speed that if it gets back to 18 meters per second, again on a 10-minute average, the controls will let the system turn back on and begin producing energy again. And that would be a very steep ramp that it would go from 0 power to, when the wind drops from 19 down to 17 meters per second and stays there, then you'll get all the output of full 1 megawatt as soon as the system decides to turn itself back on. So the engineers who built wind turbines will put a design limit on the unit based on what they calculate its capacity is to handle wind loading. Each different blades and different hubs generators will give you different limits here. They are all equipped with sensors to detect when the wind speed has gotten too high, and then they have a control system that will stop this turbine from turning and generating power, so you give up the electricity that you would like to be generating because there's just too much wind and the system isn't going to cope well with it. The simplest method is to use a brake and just allow the blades to stall. They will have very high drag when they're prevented from rotating through the wind. This will put very high strains on the system, but they'll be static strains in the sense that because the system isn't rotating, it's not going through the same extremes as the blade passes through lower and higher heights. This is more prone to generating high noise. A better design most larger turbines use is to use pitch control so that the blades can turn to change their angle of attack into even a very high wind so that they produce no lift at all. When you rotate the blades facing the wind so that they're not generating any lift, then there's no drag. The wind turbine stops producing power, the blades stop rotating, but they are not creating that great amount of drag, so there's not a lot of extra noise generated. Then again, the design is to have the sensors watch for, say, a 10-minute average to go below a designed cut back in speed. And when the wind gets back there, then the controls would change the pitch back to the direction where they have lift and they begin rotating again. Here's a photo and a diagram showing where that control would take effect, that you rotate in a typical, most wind turbines these days are 3-bladed. And so here's a photo showing with red arrows where the root of each blade would be controlled, and then a mechanical diagram for a particular model from China showing how there would be internal hydraulic pushers that would take the root of the blade and simply turn it relative to the hub until it faced into the wind to change the angle of attack to either give up power, or when you've decided the wind is the right speed, that you turn the power back on. Now let's look at what one blade of a wind turbine looks like. The blade is not so much like an airplane wing as it is like the blade of a propeller, and some of the design work that's gone into airplane propellers actually carries over here. There's a whole system of standards for these known as NACA. So the airfoil of the blade is going to generate lift along the length of the entire blade, but the catch is that the blade is moving through the air in a circle, so that the parts near the root of the blade have a lower rotational angular velocity, and the wind that they are generating lift from is the combination of the ambient moving air and their own relative velocity in rotation. So you can see from this diagram that along the chord of this one foil here, there are different airfoil sections. So the one on the left, the yellow, shows a very thick and steep angle of attack for the root of the blade. In the middle of the blade, it's a medium thickness and a moderate angle of attack with a long chord. And out at the tip, because it tapers, the chord gets a little shorter, the angle of attack is very small, and that all optimizes so that each part of the blade is producing angular moment, in concert, so that they all contribute equally to the torque. One technique for managing how the turbine blades behave when the wind goes beyond the capacity of the system, when it's already turning the turbine, the generator, at the maximum power rated, and extra wind is really kind of lost to us, is that you'll have stresses on the blades from they're producing more torque than the generator can accept. What you do is have a very steep angle of attack near the root. This will cause it to stall. That's the concept that you can see in airplane wings, that if you pull the angle much steeper into the flow of wind, at a certain point the laminar flow begins to break away. And if you have a twist throughout the length of a wind turbine blade, you can make it so that the root of the blade intentionally starts stalling first, so that the tips are still producing lift when the speed of the wind has gotten to where the parts at the root are having that breakup of the laminar flow. That way you can also manage the airflow so that you put vortex generators along the root. Then you kind of manage how much flow separation you get.
So this is a diagram I made up, and there's a similar one, perhaps just as clear, maybe easier to understand in the AHO article, so please have a look there. If you look at the characteristics of what a wind turbine can provide, given based on the varying wind speed, there's a ramp up input as the wind comes off. Like there's no output when the wind is at 4 meters per second, and then as it gets higher, you ramp up in an S curve until you reach the peak output, the design capacity of the turbine. And from there on, more wind doesn't give you more power. You can just go at your peak rated output. Then there's a cutout speed where above that, you don't want to let the wind turbine turn. The power grid should still be okay with you giving them the power, but you can't mechanically cope with that much wind power. So you're going to protect your own equipment by cutting out. And they have speeds for instantaneous cutout that if the wind gets to 30 meters per second, you just stop inputting, you put the brakes on or feather your blades immediately. If it stays 10 minutes averaging over 25 meters per second on this specific design, you also then cut out, and then you wait to provide hysteresis and avoid cutting in and out too often. You wait for the wind to drop back to a 10-minute average of, say, 18 meters per second for this example turbine. Then you allow the power to come back on. So this needs to be handled in your control design, that your own turbine may need to cut itself out, even if the grid operator wanted you to have it running. Again, AHO does a great job explaining all these kinds of things, and they talk about some really neat control technologies on the margins that I can't really do any better than they did.
Now let's look at the statistical properties of wind. Whatever location you work in, you can set up a wind measurement instrument, anemometer, let it run for a good length of time. Often the studies will take 1 or 2 years of data. Then you take the wind speeds that you're seeing there and bin them, and statistically you'll see a nice smoothly varying curve like this that's a little bit like Gaussian, except that it's not symmetrical. The difference is that wind speed is always defined to be positive, so whatever direction it's flowing, you don't count going west as negative or anything like that. Whichever angle the wind comes in, where it passes your point of measurement, the direction that it carries on out from there is considered the positive direction. And so statistically you get this, the wind speed is never really quite zero. You'll see on this one that it's very close. It's rarely down at the first bin there, and there's always a little bit, and then there's often a little more. Then less and less often there's very, very high winds. So the shape of this curve reflects the characteristics of a given site, and you can generalize this with the equation for the curve shape that's known as the Weibull distribution. It's a derivative a little bit like Gaussian. So we can look at the equation in a moment. Anyway, here's a typical site that's been measured, and then they put in the three characteristic numbers. There's a scale factor and an exponent, and with those numbers, you can kind of get a sense of the statistics of any given site. Once you have the statistical spread of the wind speeds at a given site that you would expect to be which will be drawing the energy source, you can take a particular model of wind turbine and pair it up, taking the diagram I showed earlier, and then just compare how this links up with the wind speed distribution. And then by kind of multiplying these together, you can come up with a projection of how much power you would expect to produce at that site with that model. So in the cutoff speed down at less than 4 meters per second, that's the left-hand red square on the Weibull curve. That's an area where, in those statistical bins, you don't have any output. When the wind speeds are in the low end, when you're on the lower slope of the curve between 5 and 10 meters per second, I've drawn an orange box around those, and you can see that there's a bit of more frequent cases where the wind is at those speeds, and then you would have below your rated capacity, you'd have 200, 300, or 400 kilowatts rather than the 1 megawatt rated power. In the dark green box, you're getting closer. You're in the upper half of the S curve, and there you're in the upper half of the power range that this unit can produce. Once you reach the aqua or dark blue bar, you get to the rated capacity, and so somewhere just around half of the wind speeds at the site that I've taken as a sample here are in this range where you're working your way up to the rated capacity. And then to the right of that, the lighter green box, the wind is strong enough for the turbine to run at 100% all the time. Next, you get to the area where you might have to look at the cutoff. So if the wind moves up into the pale blue box, up to less than 25 meters per second, the system continues producing at its full power, and so all of these bins here might be able to have the turbine produce at 1 megawatt. However, if they come in the midst of a very high gust, when you've reached the cutoff, if you've gone more than 10 minutes above 25 meters, or any time at all above 30 meters per second, then the system will cut out. So all of those bins in the tail are out of reach to you. You won't, but your system, this wind turbine, won't be able to produce any power then. And the bins inside the blue box, the pale blue on the right at 20 meters and up, those ones would only be available to you if the system has been able to get back to reset. So this statistical distribution doesn't tell you, because it's time independent, it doesn't tell you when these occurred. So you'd need to look a little closer if you expected to have it getting to the cutoff frequency once in a while. You could need to factor in that some of those blue ones wouldn't necessarily pay for you because the system had been in cutoff, had to wait for the wind to drop below 18 to let it cut back in again. So once someone's taken that kind of analysis and selected a wind turbine to put in a particular site and they've got the measurements, a wind turbine in a good wind site might achieve a capacity factor in the range of 30 to 35%. And recall that capacity factor is the percentage of the nameplate rated capacity that the system will actually deliver, given that the source is a varying input. That yield is pivotal in doing your costing. So you need to have accurate yield projections in order to do the planning to decide if a project is going to pay. Only the best sites are going to yield even this nice range of capacity factors. If you put a wind turbine somewhere else because you have load there and the wind isn't as strong in those locations, you'll get lower capacity factors. Also, the wind is seasonal, so that will vary over the course of the year. You'll have more power in some months than others. Wind power varies with air density. Cold air is more dense, so in the winter you get better yields, typically from wind turbines. That means, in addition, winter weather tends to have windier weather systems, so you'll have more output in the winter. Now I have to let my dog out. So you can look at the wind as a whole as being a natural resource, and it's a renewable one. It's self-renewing. The sun shines, it creates differential heat across the surface of the Earth, and causes the air to circulate, and we can extract some of that energy. So you can do what's known as a wind resource assessment. This is something you can do on a national scale, maybe even just on a regional and local scale. You can approach this with aggregating lots and lots of existing wind measurements, but typically you do it with atmospheric airflow models. So you do software, and when you come to an individual site, then you can look at putting in instruments dedicated specifically for the purpose of getting really accurate statistics about how often the wind is blowing, how strong through it. And generally that'll be a 1 to 2 year study. Theoretically, the potential available energy from this resource is really, really vast. It's been described as being more than 40 times current worldwide consumption of electricity, even more than 5 times the entire global energy in all forms, and that's from an article in PNAS in 2009. There's the link. So with that enormous potential resource out there, how much of that can actually be exploited? So really it all comes down to cost effectiveness. What turbines can be built for how much, and how much electricity demand is there, who's willing to pay, how many cents per kilowatt hour to put you in business to sell the electricity to them. And in addition, not everywhere on Earth can be a site where you're going to put a wind turbine. So you need to have site availability. The site has to be acceptable. There's a lot of places that you would exclude. Nature reserves, national and provincial parks. Near an airport, there might be height restrictions so that you can't have a wind turbine in that flight path. After you screen sites for which ones are completely excluded, then you also have to work through planning processes from municipal and provincial governments that have the power to say whether land can be zoned for a given usage, to give you permission to do this, as well as having permission to connect to the power grid. So when you're putting wind turbines where people can see them, you can't put them in valleys because just because they're less visible, there's no wind in the valley. You have to put them on the hillside where everyone can see it. These wind turbines do produce some noise. People have speculated about whether there's some form of infrasound. Areas where there's been a lot of public opposition to wind, people have cited a real mixture of mysterious symptoms. People have headaches, and they attribute it to the wind farm that went in, and that they were asked, could we do this? And maybe they lost the vote. On a specific concrete basis, people perceive specific dangers from an operating wind farm. Maybe the turbine might just fall over if you've done a bad job. There was one that actually people did a poor job pouring the concrete for the base. The turbine fell over, and one activist group very opposed to wind published maybe 37 photos of that one fallen over wind turbine, trying to make it look as though all of them are going to hit you on the head. And more concretely and practically, in icy conditions, ice can form on the blades, and that ice can throw off. So if you're, a farmer and you have wind turbines in your rangeland, you would have to plan around that if there's an ice storm going on, maybe that's not the day to be out in your tractor. Then, of course, there was U.S. President Trump, who tried to say that he was against wind on the grounds that they cause some kind of cancer. Don't ask me. I don't know what he's talking about. That's not real. So another constraint on being able to integrate the vast amount of wind that's out there into the power grids that we have is that you can't just build a wind turbine where there's no transmission. You have to get hooked in, and you might then incur the cost for adding a substation to be able to hook into existing lines. You might need to run transmission lines or enlarge ones that are there. And adding transmission lines itself is a permitting challenge. The public has, an innate resistance to the requests to add new transmission lines near them. Once you have the permission to do this, then you would need operating controls that will make the new sources work smoothly with the existing power grid. So power grid management, that has a whole technique, a whole science for managing the sources that are there, controlling their frequency. And when you're on, let's say, a remote location where the grid is just a single line that both feeds residents there and now is taking your wind, you might be introducing a lot of power, and you can actually cause people's lights to flicker. That's come up in the past. So when you look at the nameplate capacity of a wind turbine such as 1 megawatt, the system isn't just something you can have exactly the right amount of wind for that, switch it on when you want that 1 megawatt. You take the amount of wind that comes, and as we saw, the wind varies, and so over time, a given wind turbine will operate at at some percentage of its rated nameplate capacity. That's known as the capacity factor. So this will vary with how you're applying it and what technology is in place there. And for wind, this is a really crucial statistic. So when you're planning the capacity of an entire regional power grid, you can take the capacity factor that a wind turbine is expected to work at and use that to say how much total power the system will have available on average over time. You can't take a 1 megawatt wind turbine and claim that it's contributing to 1 megawatt of capacity of the system, because it will only operate at its rated nameplate capacity some part of the time, a few days a week kind of thing. So capacity factor is a really critical number to know. You have to have that when you're going to say what contribution wind is going to make to a regional power grid. Other sources that are dispatchable, you can talk about their nameplate capacity, and they're really contributing that amount to the capacity of the grid. Say a natural gas plant, you can have 1 megawatt of natural gas, you turn the gas on, you make steam, and electricity comes out, and you're running at your rated capacity if that's what they've asked you to do. You've got a knob that you can turn it up and down. You can't turn the wind up and down, so you just wait and let the wind blow, and you accept what you can get from it as long as there's a place for it in the power grid when it's blowing. On a hydro reservoir, by contrast, you can run at 100% of its rated capacity whenever there's enough water in the reservoir. So their capacity factor is more an annual statistic as opposed to something that varies from day to day. The hydro reservoir can be dispatchable. It just needs to manage how much of the water that they use up in the course of a year. There'll be a dry season and a rainy and snowy season that puts the water back in the reservoir. So because hydropower is dispatchable, that leads to some interesting prospects where you might have areas out in remote locations that have hydro dams might also be good wind resources, and you might be able to co-locate and coordinate the wind power with the hydro. And when the wind is blowing strongly, let it use all of the transmission capacity and hold back. Don't use up any of your water from the reservoir. When the wind slows down, the hydro reservoir could step in and use more of its power. Another alternative is that there's some reservoirs that can be arranged to have pump storage, where if the electric grid has more power available than the customers are demanding right now, you could use up the excess to pump water uphill back into the reservoir to save it for another day. So let's talk about the concept of power dispatch. When you're operating a power grid, the power being generated and fed into the grid has to exactly match the power being drawn by all the customers combined, all the loads. And you can track with metering how much demand there is. You've also got past history to say what you expect that the load is going to be, but it does vary through the day. So traditional dispatchable sources, the power grid operator has just simply called or scheduled to say this plant should be on at this % power at this hour. With wind, you don't have that option to be dispatching it. When it's blowing, there's power available that you could take if there's demand. But if the wind is blowing and there's no demand, you have to just curtail the wind and not consume it. And if there's demand and the wind isn't blowing, there's nothing you can do. You have to go to some other source. Wind forecasting software is a key area of development. There's been great progress lately. With a good forecast, a network operator can make the best use of the output of wind resources. You can incorporate the forecasted output for a specific wind farm into the process of scheduling the power dispatch for the entire grid for the coming day. You can set up costing methods that will pay the wind operator for forecasting correctly so that they're rewarded for delivering the same amount of power that they forecast that they would do. Now let's look at how grid operators encounter the varying demand through the day and how the dispatch takes care of that and the different classes of resources that fit in to take care of it. There's what's known as base load that would run basically 24 hours a day to cover the lowest level of demand that occurs typically at night. That's the base. And then with other sources coming layered on top of that as demand changes through the day. So there are intermediate or what are called load following sources, and then peaking energy sources that take care of just the little tiny tips. So you might have 2 peaks on a winter time schedule, maybe only 1 peak on summer where there's say air conditioning load. Whereas in the winter, the solar gain during the day reduces your heating load when the sun is shining in your window. So here's a graph from one day on an example power grid that shows the mix of sources as they were applied for base load, load following, and peaking. If you look at this graph, nuclear power was kept on in a constant state. It was providing 8 gigawatts of the power for this grid. Combined cycle gas turbines covered mostly base load and then did a little bit of load following through sort of 8 a.m. to 9 p.m., somewhere in there. There were interconnects, that is, transmission from neighboring control areas. They were pretty constant. And then coal was the source in this particular power grid that did the most load following. So it ramped up quite a lot as the sun came up in the morning and power became, more people turned lights on and used energy. And then there were a few other resources. There was some oil, some blue, other, I don't know what that is, and there was pump storage available in this grid. So those all took care of peaking. So if you see around 4 p.m., demand starts to peak up. And while coal ramps up gradually, some of these other storages, including the pump storage, react very quickly. Load following, that's the concept that the power grid has to track varying demand throughout the day. Generation must exactly equal consumption. If it doesn't, the grid becomes unstable. Demand will vary throughout the day and the night, and there'll be a daily peak level that reflects weather extremes, since electricity contributes to both space heating and cooling. Then power sources can be classified into the role that they play in doing this load following. There's base load, that would be nuclear in Ontario as well as hydro, and a load following where hydro, gas, and when we had it coal, could be dispatched to ramp to keep closely following what the load is. And then finally peaking, where a source can be turned on quickly to ramp up for a very large increase in demand, say everybody getting home and turning on their ovens. Again, gas does that today, and coal used to do so. Here's the output report from Ontario Hydro. The Independent Electricity System Operator, IESO, recorded what their projected demand said. The model said that they were going to expect to need to have and that they scheduled to be able to dispatch. The blue line that stepped by hour, and then the green line is the actual demand that they measured. And you can see they did quite a good job of being ready with the amount of power needed for the demand that actually came around. This is for a day that was a record demand in the province for a winter day. I don't know, this is some years ago, so whether that's the record anymore, I couldn't tell you. However, wind power is not controllable or dispatchable, so a grid operator will not be able to ask for the wind to just begin blowing now so that I need the electricity. However, a power grid will have other sources that are known as spinning reserve as backup. This allows for the amount of spinning reserve you have is to allow for emergencies where any one large source from all of your generating sources might cut out at any time. They could have an emergency. So the unplanned outage of your largest source has to be matched by enough spinning reserve to make that up to keep the power grid stable. So because wind is varying, it's another input that the grid operator needs to adjust to, just as they already adjust for varying demand. You can get short-range wind forecasts, and you may also be able to balance wind with hydroelectricity, as we discussed. Wind could benefit quite significantly from being able to be paired with energy storage systems such as batteries. And if you have widely dispersed wind sites, the correlation between them is reduced, and that means that wind will tend to have a statistical average of being completely unavailable far less often. Here's samples from a wind reporting site that shows what the model forecast had been for the day in the thick purple line that tracks along the top, and then the actual measurements hour by hour showing the blue line was the persistent wind, green line were the lulls, and the red line were the gusts at each hour. And you can see that the forecast was a little optimistic that day. So the gusts were meeting the forecast level, but the sustained winds were below. And then from sort of 5:30 to 6:45, there was a really big lull that was quite a bit below forecast. People doing the long-range planning for the capacity of a power system have to treat wind differently than other proposed generating sources that they know will be dispatchable. Could a wind power system contribute anything to the system capacity for an entire region? There are cases where wind operators earn what are known as capacity credits for some percentage of their nameplate capacity by sort of rounding down from their capacity factor and saying, well, most of the time the wind will be at least some fraction of the forecast amount. If you had energy storage, you could get further along on this and provide more capacity.
Here's a very recent headline highlighting just how much is happening with pairing wind with storage. People are seeing the benefits of doing this. Headline says the Europe's biggest battery opened in East Yorkshire. It has the capacity to store enough energy to power about 300,000 homes for 2 hours. It ties into the national grid. It's important to add that these projects are not supported by taxpayer subsidies, so this is economically competitive. The battery costs add enough value that you can cover you can justify putting them in, cover the cost of adding the batteries. So we have to ask, could wind and solar together begin to take over and meet all of total energy demand? In the past, baseload and load following, peak following for electricity grids have had to rely on dispatchable sources that were always just fossil fuels. To be able to eliminate carbon emissions, could we replace all the fossil fuels with hydro plus wind plus solar plus this kind of storage, both pump storage and battery based? There's a growing body of research showing that 100% renewable energy is feasible, and it can be done at little or no extra cost compared to the existing fossil fuel-based things. So the article I'm going to talk about in the next slide, Jacobson and DeLucchi, is entitled 100% Clean and Renewable Wind, Water, and Sunlight, All Sector Energy Roadmap for the 50 United States. And there's links here. Then on the next slide, we'll see another link as well. So then we could ask, how far could we take this? Can renewables actually meet the entire total electricity demand for the whole world? And there's some excellent research on this from a couple of professors out in California, DeLucchi and Jacobson. Here are citations to the very links, highly cited articles cited by 1,820 people when I looked it up, providing all global energy with wind, water, and solar power. And their part one is the technologies, the area, and what it would take. And then their part two is how you would fit that into the power grid, dealing with electricity reliability and the system stuff. So that's some of the interesting themes that also come up in the Aho et al. Summary, how you could use wind in a large-scale power grid and deal with synchronization, system stability, reliability, reactive power, all of those fancy things that the electrical engineering department can tell you about. So Jacobson and DeLucchi at Stanford did a really impressive project where they took their model that they had applied to North America and then extended it to see as a projection how much could you do with just wind, water, and solar power in 139 different countries. And they found that just about everywhere you could meet demand, eliminating all fossil fuels and using just renewables by 2050, and you'd actually create more jobs. You'd lose 27 million jobs in fossil energy, but create 52 million jobs in renewables. So a net gain in jobs, and you'd save money. It looks like a great win-win. And here's the web link to how to see all that. Excellent stuff. And here's a citation to a more recent 2017 work by the same authors and additional people, recapping the idea that they have plans that address 139 different countries to reach 100% renewables. The DOI link is to the original article in Joule, and then the lower link is to their website at Stanford, which actually links to an earlier edition that talked about plans for each of the US 50 states. Both are worth reading. Then there's the concept of wind penetration, of how much of the power at any given moment is being delivered from wind power or from clean sources generally. Here's some very recent headlines from Germany, from Greece, and from Britain about cases where their regional or local grids reached 100% clean source power for just short periods of time. But we're beginning to see that grids are operating, they're staying stable, they're not crashing when all of the sources are from variable inputs.
Let's look at the steps in conducting a wind project. First, you're planning it. You need to look at the choice of site and the number and type of turbines that will go there. So you can tailor the height of towers, the size of the rotor, and the model of generator to the specific site that you're going to be building in. You'll need to do a cost projection. So you begin with a wind study where you model the output of the selected area and then possibly do an in-site measurement study where you put an anemometer in, track the data over the course of a year or two, then kind of verify what the model was predicting for you. Then you also need to make a financial plan. That's the biggest input there, is the cost of borrowing and what rate of return you have to make on your capital. There's a really good Canadian software source. It's free to the public. It's known as RETScreen, has 250,000 users worldwide, and it covers a number of sources, not only wind. It also looks at energy efficiency for buildings. It's quite comprehensive. It's worth a look. So in planning a wind project, you would go through the selection of the specific model of wind turbine, make a projection of how much specific yield that model of wind turbine will do in the site you're looking at. Then you can do a financial evaluation looking at your cost of borrowing and rate of return. You can also then factor in some financial incentives that have been available in policy conditions. So there are several different jurisdictions that have approached this differently. A lot of places have what's known as a renewable portfolio standard, where a given utility has to get a certain percentage of its power from non-carbon emitting sources, and you can leverage that in saying, you need to get us to bring this project in because it fits those requirements. One implementation of that in the US has been what they call green tags, where the person generating the carbon-free electricity gets some sort of a renewable energy certificate or credit, and then that is something you can sell within the utility market to allow people to, they can buy these credits in order to meet the requirements of an RPS. There was a tax incentive that the US has had on and off over maybe a decade or more, that the Congress brought in and then they let it expire and they brought it back again, called the Wind Industry Production Incentive. It's based on tax credits, so you basically have to have some tax payable in order to make any use of it. So there's a complicated process of pairing up people who are making enough money to pay taxes with people who are generating from the wind. There's another model where you give a feed-in tariff, that there's, in addition to whatever contractual rate you get, the system pays you some additional incentive just because you're producing green power. So Germany was a pioneer in that area. Ontario had a model like that briefly, and it was then canceled. So these sorts of incentives are aimed at making projects more viable in order to kind of get a foot in the door to get over the hurdle of being an outside new source that isn't part of the system yet. So in the US, the federal wind production tax credit was 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour over 10-year contracts. Again, as I mentioned, that was funded by Congress and then cut off and started and stopped. So there's a Wikipedia page giving the history. In Canada, the federal system had an eco-energy credit incentive for renewable power of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. That was launched in 2007 and was closed in 2011. There's a web link about that. In Europe, they've had stronger incentives. Countries like Germany, Denmark, Spain, and the UK have each gone through government programs like that. Another incentive that's interesting in our experience is the Ontario Green Electricity Green Energy Act of 2009. This was introduced by a provincial Liberal government. There's a link describing the history. It used feed-in tariffs modeled on how Germany ran their program. Each successful applicant would get a fixed 20-year contract rate where the utility was paying them this specified amount. For onshore wind of any size, you'd get 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Later that was cut to 12.5 cents. Offshore wind was offered 19 cents per kilowatt hour. None was actually built under this program offshore. This policy was repealed in the January of 2019 by incoming Conservative Premier Doug Ford. So when you're doing a site assessment, you need to look at local effects of the surface characteristics on the wind that you'll get. So you can do a large-scale regional wind model, but you need to do what's known as downscaling to look at how the site would work out on a local basis. You really ultimately have to take direct wind measurements for ground truth to come up with a really reliable prediction. So you'd take 1 to 2 years of data logging, and often these would be done with either an anemometer or a LiDAR system. You collect data on the mean wind, the variance, and the gust factors, which, as we saw, had an effect on the productivity of a wind farm. Then you create a frequency distribution over wind speeds. That gives you a basis for saying what you can expect to produce with a wind turbine there. So in the process of wind prospecting, you might go through steps like this. First, you'd look for all the best wind sites using one of those regional assessment maps. You'd factor in the expected wind power in a site, as well as its distance from market load centers and to the power grid. Then you'd use the wind mapping and wind resources assessment. You can look at the wind atlas for a country or for a state or province. You look at promising sites. Look at land availability. Can you buy land there, or can you lease space to put the wind turbines? Can it be in joint use between, say, wind turbine and ranching, grazing, those kind of things? The animals just walk around the tower and they don't bump into it. The proximity to the grid, and then sort of local political conditions, whether the public have receptiveness or resistance to you coming in and making a deal like this, and then the permitting process. Then you've kind of gone on to the stage where you take those direct measurements. So we'll look at the wind resource within Canada. Canada has really substantial seasonal variation, as you might imagine. We also have a very wide land area with lots of varying geography types, different surfaces with different surface roughnesses. The best wind in Canada isn't necessarily anywhere near where the load centers are or to existing transmission lines. Here's information about where power stations are. Mapping Canada's winds, there's a really valuable resource in the Canadian Wind Atlas. That's a wind resource assessment for the entire country. On this rectangular grid, you can see that the points in the model of how much wind there is are color-coded, with dark blue being the lowest wind availability and the reds and maroons being really super strong winds. Here's another map that shows the existing power grid across Canada, and you can see that most of the population is concentrated near the US border, so that's where a lot of the transmission arrives, but some of it comes from remote sites that have really large hydro dams in northern Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and then power grids running up into central Alberta, which are also tied in with energy production in the oil sands. Here's a really nice new map that was put out by Ontario Power Generation OPG that shows the location of nuclear, gas, biofuel, hydroelectric, wind, and solar plants across the province. And you can see there's quite an interesting mix. Hydro's scattered across many of the more remote links across the north. And down in southern Ontario, there's a lot of the light green circles showing wind power. Here's a zoomed in view of southern Ontario with the same information. And this gives you a look at where we have power grid connections, the dark lines for the high capacity lines, and then the different shadings for the smaller lines. Finally, here's an even closer zoom to southwestern Ontario, and here you can see a nice view of where the many wind farms are spread across, really along the coastal edges of the Great Lakes, where there's likely to be lots of wind that's coming off the lake. Here's another view that overlays a view of the power grid with a couple of major power plant locations, including the former location of the Nanticoke coal-fired plant. That and a wind resource map from the Canadian Wind Atlas for this region. And so that's an interesting way to look at where you might find sites with some good amount of wind that are also close to power grid. So here's a wind map that I captured from 2010 when it was a really strong northeasterly wind. And an interesting thing you can see illustrated here is that the surface characteristics, the surface roughness, has a big effect on how much wind from a given airflow shows up down at the surface. So in cottage country up north of Toronto, the wind levels at the surface were quite low because the surface is quite rough there. Whereas over the Great Lakes, with the flat surface of the water, the high-speed winds that are aloft can reach right down near the surface, giving you very high waves on the lake. But if you had an offshore wind installation there, they would experience those really high winds. And then I've matched that up with the levels that I picked from that sample representative wind turbine model. You can see that the winds on this map are coming up in the range of 24 to 26 knots. This is a sailor's map, so I've scaled it in knots, but you can convert that to meters per second. 1 knot is about 0.5 of a meter per second. So the 25 knot speed would be about 12 or 14 meters per second. That would be in the 100% output range for the turbine that we looked at. If you got into stronger winds than are showing on this map, you might reach the point where the wind would need to get back to that. But only on rare, really stormy days would you get maps like this showing any of the maroon and purple levels. And this color scheme for this wind mapping site doesn't even have any colors available for the really strong winds like 44 knots or something like 28 meters per second, where the 10-minute cutoff for that particular model would cut in. So looking across the Canadian Wind Atlas, let's look at spots where there are particularly strong winds. Some of the best sites that are onshore are very remote. The Pacific Coast has lots of good places. The Canadian Rockies along the ridgelines, in Labrador, northern Quebec, and the north shore of Ontario facing Hudson's Bay. The next best sites that are somewhat closer to load centers might be southern Alberta, the prairies broadly, the ocean coasts, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Hydro-Quebec has their Le Nord wind plant in that location, and then locally in the Maritimes, such as the North Cape of PEI. Then the moderate ones, colored in sort of green and aqua on this map, might include southwest Ontario between the lakes. And if you look offshore, the ocean coasts of Canada show from this model ridiculously high levels of winds. These are most extreme conditions for siting. You deal with very high ocean waves and the potential for ice. They're also really far, most of them from load centers, with exception of maybe near the end of Vancouver Island. Looking at Hudson's Bay, that's a really, really nice windy area, but it ices over for a quite substantial season of the year. Then there's the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where you're again looking at a lot closer to load there. More hotspots looking offshore. You can look at the Great Lakes. You're in fresh water, but you're still offshore, and you'd have some of the same challenges with needing to anchor to the bottom. But these are much closer to load. The entire Great Lakes area has some interesting prospects for wind. In 2010, Toronto Hydro put on a project to look at putting 80 turbines offshore in Lake Ontario near Scarborough. They got as far as putting up the LiDAR to measure the levels of the wind. However, they didn't get that far with planning this project. There was a lot of really strong local vocal opposition. People went to their members of parliament, members of provincial legislature, and the first thing that happened was that the Green Energy, Green Electricity Act of Ontario had the power for the minister to regulate the distances, the offsets from power sources like wind turbines to residences, and they increased those offsets in response to public pressure by quite a lot. The effect of this on the planned offshore one was that they would have had to go much further offshore because the entire shoreline had residential occupation. And the effect of that would have been that they would have been in much, much deeper water, and that would have affected the economics of it. The whole thing ended really when the province imposed a moratorium on offshore wind, and they cut the offer to make 19 cents per kilowatt hour feed-in tariff available to offshore wind projects at all. So the link shown here shows a news story about that event. So based on that, you can see that offshore wind hasn't really taken root in Canada yet. It's not realized. There's a website here describing offshore wind farms, and they say that Canada has 31 projects foregoing to build wind farms offshore, of which none are currently operating, none where construction has progressed enough to connect to the turbines to generate electricity, none that are in the building phase, and none that are either consented or have applied for consent. In other words, we haven't done it. Here's a nice recent map showing locations of wind farms across Canada, and you can see that they're really quite widely distributed. A few in the very far north in isolated communities that are off the main power grid. So these are really effectively standalone ones where the wind lets you reduce your dependency on expensive flown-in diesel oil. And then across the rest of the country, kind of mostly concentrated around where there's a population, as well as the places that we saw that had good wind resources, including Nova Scotia, southern Western Ontario, and the prairies in Alberta. So if you think back to the Canadian Wind Atlas map, you can look at where all the bright spots are on there and look at how these dots are spread out, and you can see a pretty good match that people have figured out how to go where the wind is and when they can reach the load centers, and that's where wind is taking off in Canada. And there's plenty more that I could tell you about this, but I need to stop and let you guys finish up and go back and do the rest of your homework. So I've made a couple of slides here with links to additional resources where you can find out more about all of these topics. The IRENA, International Renewable Energy Association, is an excellent source. Looking at the money side of green energy, Bloomberg's New Energy Finance, I like quite a lot. There's the Carbon Disclosure Project that discusses committing corporations to disclose how much carbon their operations, how many emissions they incur. And there are people working on making this a part of the whole financial disclosure that companies have to make to be on the stock market. Carbon Brief is another really good news source. The Climate Action Tracker looks at everybody's commitments that they've made under the Paris Accord and how far people are progressing in actually meeting those. Then there's the Energy Transition Show. That's one podcast that I really, really recommend. It's run by Chris Nelder. There's the link for it. And then the magazine WindPower Monthly has a nice range of articles on topics related to this. Here's a collection of links to wind energy trade associations. There's the Global Wind Energy Council. That one applies to the entire world. And somehow we managed to get two. There's also the World Wind Energy Association. And then here are links for the American, Canadian, European, Indian, Asian, and Chinese wind associations. Further on local or national wind energy trade groups, there's links here for Australia, New Zealand, for Africa, Brazil, Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and then the site on Wind Power Monthly magazine, they have useful links, and they include many of the ones I've shown you here, plus a bunch more if you want to look at individual countries.